What happens when a man who built his image on control walks into a moment he cannot control and everything shifts in seconds? Stay with me because this story only gets more intense. And if you love real drama and deep breakdowns, hit subscribe right now and join the fastest growing channel for stories everyone is talking about. For years, viewers have watched a story unfold that felt larger than life. A story built on control, expectations, and a very carefully maintained image of authority. A man who believed his presence alone could shape every room he entered. A man who expected loyalty without question and respect without resistance. But what happens when that carefully constructed image is placed in a situation it cannot control? What happens when the usual reactions no longer appear and the expected outcomes simply do not arrive? This is where everything begins to shift. Because according to circulating insider discussions, there was a moment recently that completely disrupted that pattern. A moment that did not rely on shouting or confrontation, but instead unfolded through silence, stillness, and an unexpected lack of reaction. And that alone made it powerful. Because when someone is used to dominating through energy, through volume, through presence, the absence of those reactions creates a kind of tension that cannot be ignored. And that is exactly what seems to have happened when Cody unexpectedly found himself in the same space as Janelle and the man who has quietly entered her life. Now, this was not supposed to be a moment of uncertainty. It was expected to follow a familiar script, a controlled interaction, a display of authority, something that would reinforce everything that had been shown before. But instead, what unfolded began to challenge that narrative from the very first second, because the energy was different. The environment did not shift in response to him, and that is where the discomfort began to build. Sources suggest that Cody approached with the same confidence he has always carried, the same posture, the same expectation that his presence would dictate the tone of the moment. But what he encountered instead was something entirely unfamiliar. A calm, grounded presence that did not react, did not challenge, and did not submit. And that lack of response created a pause. And because it raises a question that lingers long after the moment ends, what happens when the strategies that once worked no longer produce the same results? What happens when the environment no longer responds in the expected way? And perhaps most importantly, what happens when someone is forced to face a version of themselves that no longer aligns with reality? And as more details begin to emerge and more perspectives are shared, this moment continues to gain attention, not because of conflict, but because of what it represents: a turning point, a shift in dynamic, and a subtle yet powerful reminder that not all battles are fought with words. Some are revealed in silence and understood through presence alone. And that is what keeps viewers watching, what keeps the conversation growing, and what ensures that this story is far from over. As the moment continued to unfold, the tension did not disappear. Instead, it evolved into something far more complex and far more revealing, because what made this interaction so compelling was not a sudden burst of drama, but the steady realization that the expected outcome was no longer within reach. Sources close to the situation suggest that Cody attempted to regain control in subtle ways: small shifts in posture, slight changes in tone, carefully chosen words that in the past would have guided the direction of the conversation. But this time, those efforts seemed to land differently, almost as if they were absorbed without impact. And that is where the unease began to grow. Because when familiar strategies stop producing familiar results, it creates a kind of internal pressure, one that builds quietly but steadily and becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. And as this pressure built, the contrast between the two individuals in that space became even more pronounced. On one side, there was a visible attempt to steer the moment, to reshape it into something recognizable, something manageable. And on the other side, there was stillness, a grounded presence that neither resisted nor engaged in the expected way. And this imbalance created a dynamic that was difficult to navigate, because without resistance, there was nothing to overcome, and without engagement, there was nothing to control. And that is what made each passing second feel heavier, more significant, more revealing. Insiders describe this phase of the interaction as a turning point, not because anything dramatic was said, but because of what became clear in the absence of reaction. The realization that the energy driving the moment was no longer aligned, that one person was operating from expectation while the other remained unaffected by it. And that disconnect created a kind of silent exposure where every movement, every glance, and every pause carried meaning. And as the cameras reportedly continued to capture this unfolding dynamic, it became evident that the story being told was not one of confrontation, but of contrast, a quiet demonstration of how different approaches to presence can shape an entire interaction without a single raised voice. And what makes this even more intriguing is the way it challenges long-held assumptions about authority and influence. Because in this moment, authority was not established through dominance or control, but through composure, through the ability to remain steady regardless of external pressure. And that is something that cannot of imbalance that could not be corrected through effort alone. And as this realization began to settle, the atmosphere reportedly shifted in a way that was subtle yet undeniable. The urgency faded, the expectation of escalation diminished, and in its place was a growing awareness that the interaction was no longer following a predictable path. And that unpredictability is what held attention, what created suspense, and what made it impossible to look away, because it introduced a question that had no immediate answer. What happens when control is no longer an option? What happens when the situation cannot be shaped or redirected, and instead must simply be experienced as it is? And this question lingered as the moment progressed, adding depth to every second, and making even the smallest details feel significant. The way one person remained composed while the other searched for footing, the way silence replaced reaction, and the way the entire interaction seemed to exist outside the usual framework of conflict and resolution. And as this continued, it became increasingly clear that the true impact of the moment was not in what was happening externally, but in what it revealed internally. The difference between reacting and remaining grounded, the difference between seeking validation and possessing self-assurance, and perhaps most importantly, the difference between performance and authenticity. And as these layers became more visible, the narrative began to shift away from expectation and toward understanding, a recognition that not all moments of significance are loud or dramatic. Some are quiet, measured, and deeply revealing. And that is what makes this situation so compelling, because it offers a glimpse into a dynamic that is rarely seen in such a raw and unfiltered way. A moment where the usual rules do not apply, where the expected reactions do not occur, and where the outcome is shaped not by force, but by presence alone. And as more people begin to reflect on what this means, the conversation conversation continues to grow, not because of controversy, but because of curiosity, a desire to understand how such a simple interaction could carry so much weight and what it says about the individuals involved and the dynamics they represent. And as this story continues to unfold, one thing remains certain. This was not just a passing moment, it was a shift, a subtle yet powerful change that challenges perception, invites reflection, and leaves a lasting impression that extends far beyond the interaction itself. And that is why viewers remained engaged, why discussions continue, and why this moment stands as a reminder that some